Carolyn, can you get us started this morning by telling us a little bit about when women started advocating for the right to vote?
Yeah, and I'm going to go back a little ways because women really began after having been involved in the abolition movement of the 1830s and 1840s. You know, a lot of women, both black and white, came into politics through abolition. They strongly identified as righteous Christians who recognized really serious problems with American society. They began attending abolitionist meetings, they raised money, they spoke in public on behalf of the rights of African Americans, and it gave these women a new sense of moral purpose for their lives. But along the way, they found that a lot of men in the movement found their very presence controversial. A lot of them felt that, you know, they either were not allowed to attend some abolitionist meetings or they weren't allowed to vote at others. And all of that experience, you know, as well as their incredibly close attention to the needs of African American and enslaved men and women, brought them to ultimately recognize a sort of heightened awareness of their own secondary status in the United States. So their experience with abolition made them aware of their own lack of rights. So for example, by law, married women had no right to hold property or to sign contracts. Married women had no right to keep their own wages. They had no right to keep their own children in the case of divorce. So these lacks of various kinds of rights made them utterly dependent on their husbands to sort of cover all of their own rights. And you might think that it might be better to be unmarried in this case, but in fact, most single women simply, you know, became the dependents of other men. They lived in the households of their fathers or their brothers-in-law who supported them, and they had no rights as a result. And so, you know, those kinds of legal rights became they became seen as very oppressive to women. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. That's the legal side of things. In addition, there were other conventions in the United States. So for example, women simply made much lower pay than men, even when they had the same kinds of jobs. So, you know, if you were a female school teacher, for example, you were probably making about a third of what a man was making in the same job. And in addition, you know, women had very little public voice. They had almost no access to college. Oberlin College was the first to admit women in 1835, and a very small handful of others joined them during the 1840s. But there were no colleges on the East Coast that admitted women. The colleges were in places like Ohio and Michigan and Texas. And, you know, women had no access to the professions. They couldn't enter law or medicine. So all of this sort of, you know, paralleled a larger phenomenon of, you know, in the early 19th century, the right to vote expanded radically for white men. You know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in fact, one of the major leaders of the women's rights movement, complained that the right to vote was given to, you know, and this is one of her quotes, it was given to drunkards, idiots, horse racing, rum selling rowdies, ignorant foreigners, and silly boys. All of them had the right to vote, but not educated, intelligent women like her. And that led a number of women, all of these complaints led a number of women to hold the first women's rights convention in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And that would be the first of ultimately 11 different women's rights conventions held before the Civil War. And, you know, at these conventions, they began to talk about what they ought to demand, what they needed. So the famous Declaration of Rights, Declaration of Sentiments that was released at the Seneca Falls Convention listed things like the fact that marriage had turned women into irresponsible beings, that men had monopolized all the rights and all the profitable jobs, that marriage rendered women, lacking in self-respect. And at the very last minute, Elizabeth Cady Stanton added a final item, and she said, we should add the item, it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves the sacred right to vote. And so that was really the beginning. It was a controversial addition. A lot of women felt that this was just a small aspect, or that it might ultimately raise the hackles of a lot of men. But it was really that moment in 1848 that women first began to advocate for the right to vote.
Now, this beginning of this movement, did it involve only white women, or were Black women involved too?
Oh, Black women were involved very much so. And although there were no Black women at Seneca Falls, Frederick Douglass, the famous, abolitionist, was there and very strongly advocated for the right for women to vote throughout his career. But Black women did attend several of the other women's rights conventions later on. So Sojourner Truth, for example, was one of the many Black women who attended those conventions. And I will say that because those conventions took place in ways that were much better advertised than the Seneca Falls Convention was, which was put together sort of hastily, women would travel hundreds, thousands of miles to attend some of the women's rights conventions held throughout the 1850s.
Now, I know after the Civil War, a large number of women's groups formed. Can you give us an idea of what the differences between these various groups were?
Yeah, well, I'm going to just take you back a little bit to the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, because it's really important to understand one crucial moment. So throughout the 1850s, women had been fighting for the political and social and legal equality with men, right? With the coming of the Civil War, though, a lot of the advocates sort of put their own activism on hold. They thought it was more important to dedicate themselves to the actions of the Civil War. But in the immediate aftermath of the passage of the 13th Amendment that forbade slavery in the United States, women and men throughout the country realized that the right to vote was on the table, that Congress would be considering granting Black men the right to vote. And so a lot of people flew into action trying to urge Congress to give everyone the right to vote, not just Black men, but also Black women, also white women. And of course, Congress took the conservative approach. They decided to only grant the right to vote to Black men. So the 14th Amendment is the amendment that grants all men over the age of 21 the right to vote. But because of this, white women became furious. They were infuriated by the idea that they had been forbidden the right to vote. And so, for example, you hear Sojourner Truth saying that, there's a famous quote of Sojourner Truth. She says, "There's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. If colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as before. So I am for keeping the thing going while things are stirring, because if we wait till it's still, it will take a great while to get it going again." So Truth recognized that giving Black men but not Black women the right to vote was going to be problematic for Black women. But white women in the movement were much uglier. They really sort of returned to a lot of their anger about uneducated white men having the right to vote that they had way back. And they began to talk about the problem of giving just Black men the right to vote. So for example, Susan B. Anthony, another great leader of the women's rights movement, said, if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. Um, you know, phrases that are even hard to hear now. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, again, a great hero of the movement, said, "Shall American statesmen so amend their constitutions as to make their wives and mothers the political inferiors of unlettered and unwashed ditch diggers, bootblacks, butchers, and barbers, fresh off the slave plantations of the South? This," she said, "would create an aristocracy of sex on this continent." And so some of the women who had entered in through the movement through abolition, they had been strong advocates for the abolition of slavery for all those years, simply began to offer up these racist and offensive comments about the fact that Black men had been given the right to vote and not them. And it was really that divide that marked the women's rights movements over the course of the 19th century. And so what you start to see is that a lot of the women's rights activism by the, for example, National American Women's Suffrage Association throughout the later 19th century, they were pursuing a constitutional amendment to get women the right to vote. They took a very soft view of issues of race, and they did not have a lot of Black women members. A lot of them simply did not want to pursue issues of racial justice, and they really were trying to appeal to white women. And so you really started to see a strong divide between white women's activism and Black women's activism.
We know that so many of these groups are made up of Northern women, and we wonder why. And then we know that Southern women were more hesitant to join the movement. So can you explain this divide?
Yes, Southern women, they might have in theory supported the idea of the right to vote for women, but they also recognized along racial lines that the right to vote for all women would give Black women the right to vote. And so because of the rising racial divide in the South, a lot of Southern women simply felt that they would rather not have the right to vote than give Black women the right. And so that racial divide really wound up, making a huge impact on the women's rights movement. So you started to see, for example, some of the younger members of the women's rights movement, people like Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a very aggressive and innovative activist. She was reaching out to people like working class women and immigrant women, but they did not so much appeal to Black women or to Southern women, because Southern women were so eager to support the racial lines of the franchise. And I will say also, Southern women strongly supported the sort of system of labor in the South as well. And that included child labor. Southern men were very eager to protect the right to use child labor. And they felt that if women had the right to vote, women with their sort of soft, sentimental attitudes toward children would want to forbid child labor. And so that was another reason why it was more difficult to get Southern women involved in the movement. And I'll also say that Southern women were not the only people who objected to women's right to vote. There were a lot of anti-suffragists among women in the North, in the West, people who felt that women would become more masculine if they started voting, if they started caring about politics. They felt that women had certain kinds of moral responsibilities in American society, and that those responsibilities led them to, care about things like religion, certain kinds of temperance movements, other kinds of reform, but that women had that kind of a place in society, but not a political place. Some worried that the right to vote would take women away from their children. It would distract them from being good mothers and good wives. And so, yeah, there were plenty of anti-suffrage activists.
How did that play out here in Virginia?
Yeah, in Virginia, of course, in Virginia, the Equal Suffrage League was founded in 1909 by a number of very elite, very influential white women in the Richmond area formed the Equal Suffrage League in 1909. And they adhered to a certain branch of the women's rights movement, the branch of a more conservative approach. They took the view that it was really important to appear respectable. And they wanted women to believe that the right to vote was something that a respectable woman could do. But part of that politics of respectability meant that it pulled them again away from any sense of racial justice. That they believed that being respectable meant adhering to some of the racial lines in Southern society. And so you see a lot of the dynamics in Virginia playing out along the lines of other Southern states where, they wanted to make sure that they addressed the fear of a Black vote by ensuring that so many of these educated, elite white women would be doing the voting. And that really marks a divide with some of the much younger and more aggressive and more militant activists in the movement. So, for example, the Equal Suffrage League reflected the desires of a lot of activists to have movements in every single one of the US states, active people pressuring their own state governments. But some of the newer militant members believed that that was a failed policy. And so people like Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, these were young activists who'd been very inspired by very innovative British suffrage groups, especially the activism of Emmeline Pankhurst in England. They took a much more militant approach, and they focused on Congress, US Congress, and they focused on DC rather than a state-by-state approach. And so at this point, people like Alice Paul organized really aggressive marches through the streets. They attacked the ruling leaders of Congress. They, stood outside the White House against the White House fence with big placards saying, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" They were single-minded, and they sought out other members of the movement who were willing to do, whatever was necessary to get women the right to vote. So it was a small group, but a much more visible group than a lot of the more conservative, respectable women involved in the movement. And they wanted to really stage elaborate displays of suffrage that emphasized that women could be all kinds of things. They didn't just need to be respectable mothers and respectable wives. And they were willing to get themselves arrested. And so, for example, when they ultimately chained themselves to the White House fence, police came along and arrested them and threw them in jail. And, they ceremonially burned Woodrow Wilson's speeches. So yeah, they took the movement really seriously.
What do you think some of the lessons that we can learn from the women's suffrage movement?
Well, I think that the first lesson that we can learn is how powerful racial divides were throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, it's just, it never leaves my mind the ironies that women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton came into the movement because of their dedication to the abolition of slavery, and yet equal racial justice was not a part of their ultimate goal, that their desire for their own right to vote ultimately trumped a sense of dedication to racial justice. So I think that was a powerful moment. It's also a moment, though, when you realize that, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, it's not just that this racial divide appeared and really hampered the movement, but it's also that Congress put women and Black Americans in the position of fighting against each other for the right to vote. And it's one of those classic moments when activists are presented with the prospect that only a tiny amount of equality might be given out, and I'm going to make you fight over that tiny bit of equality. And so I think that that sense that there were limited resources, that there was only so much right to vote to go around, ultimately created a lot of those racial tensions. But the tensions increased over the 19th century when you look at the ways that the white women's right to vote movement focused so much on themselves rather than on expanding the movement more generally. And I do think that ultimately the right to vote for women, you know, there's a way in which it didn't have the huge effect that people feared. A lot of the opponents to the right to vote thought that somehow the American political system would be upended by women voting. But that didn't quite happen. Women thought that the American political system would be infinitely improved, and that didn't quite happen either. And so there's a little bit of ambivalence about when you look at the 1920s and 1930s and the effect of women's votes, things don't quite look as radical on either end of the spectrum than what people hoped and expected.
Thank you, Carolyn, for telling us about the suffrage movement, and we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you.
Goodbye.